I looked at Miguel with a confused look on my face as he knelt on one knee with an engagement ring box in his hand. "What are you doing?" I asked. My mother, Laura McCline, introduced me to Miguel when I was just about 10 years old. We had recently moved because she got a new job. She wasn't keen on leaving me alone, so she hired a babysitter. He was 18 at the time and came highly recommended from wealthy people in our neighborhood. Being an only child, I never saw Miguel as a babysitter, but as an older brother. The older I got, the more comfortable I got with discussing topics that I never would with my mom. For example, boys. And I also developed a sort of crush on Miguel as well, which I kept well covered for fear that my mom would fire him. Even though Miguel and I built a great relationship over the years, I never heard him speak about his family or any friends. I didn't even know where he lived. When my 16th birthday rolled around, my mother told me that I didn't need a babysitter anymore. Miguel and I stayed in touch for a while, then we went off the grid for a few years. When I was around 21 years of age, I got a phone call. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it was Miguel. We chatted for a few hours. Then he asked if he could see me the next day, and I agreed. When Miguel came to the house the next day, my mother had already left for work. We had a few drinks, and I cooked lunch as we caught up with each other's lives. Then something happened that left me speechless. I watched as Miguel got down on one knee and asked me to marry him. I looked down at Miguel with a confused look on my face as he knelt on one knee with an engagement ring box in his hand. "What are you doing?" I asked. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said seriously. I thought that he was joking at first, but the tone of his voice sounded strange. "But didn't you just tell me that you had a girlfriend and she was pregnant?" This was what shocked me even more. We had just been talking about his girlfriend, and he had seemed so happy and in love with her. I hadn't expected him to just cast her aside like that. Miguel sank to the floor, defeated, and placed his head in his hands. I sat beside him and said nothing, as I waited for him to open up and tell me what was really going on. Eventually, he turned to me and said, "This was my girlfriend's idea." I bit my lip in an attempt to be quiet until he finished talking. He continued, "I'm in the country illegally, but if I marry someone from here, then it would buy me more time." I was extremely confused at this point. Why don't you just marry Melissa? After all, she's your girlfriend. Melissa is still married. Her divorce will take too long to finalize, Miguel said sadly. It's not that I didn't believe Miguel, but I needed to call Melissa up to find out how she felt about this entire thing. I got her number from Miguel and invited her over. After she confirmed everything Miguel said, she continued, "I don't have any friends that I trust to do this. And when Miguel spoke about you, he said he would trust you with his life, and he was willing to take that risk. I trust his judgment." "This is the only option that I have," Miguel said, his eyes pleading with mine. "I don't want to be away when my daughter is born." Melissa chimed in. "His mother's also willing to pay you $100,000 to marry her son. If you decide to marry him, it is just to keep him in the country. I will do the rest." She winked at Miguel, and he blushed. I couldn't imagine my life without Miguel. It had been 11 years since he came into my life and made it better. The past few years without him, I felt like a fish out of water. I was happy to help him and his little family. The next day, unbeknown to my mother, Miguel and I went to the courthouse with our two witnesses, Melissa and one of Miguel's coworkers, Brian. As soon as we stepped outside the courthouse, Melissa went to the car and brought out a briefcase. "Here you go," she said as she opened the case. $100,000 delivered as promised. She closed the case and handed it to me. I took it and handed over my wedding band and the marriage certificate. A few days later, my mom took me to dinner. My eyes locked with a guy, and I felt my heart flutter. He looked a few years older than me. It looked as though he was also having dinner with his family. Throughout dinner, he made these cute, funny faces, and I would giggle. When my mother and I were about to leave the restaurant, he approached us. "Good evening, ladies." He smiled at us. Then he turned to my mother and continued, "I would like to ask your daughter on a date, if it's okay with you." By this time, I was red as a cherry, and it took my mother her sweet time to say yes. "I'll be outside if you need me." My mother winked at me. I placed my hand on my face, embarrassed by my mother's antics. He introduced himself as Jet, and we exchanged numbers. Later that night, Jet sent me a message and asked if it was okay for him to call me. I said yes, and it was the beginning of a beautiful relationship. Throughout the year that Jet and I dated, I never told him about my marriage with Miguel, although I did introduce Miguel and Melissa to him. Melissa seemed relieved that I had a boyfriend. I guess it made her feel secure that I wasn't trying to steal Miguel from her. Jet and I were even invited to the christening after their baby was born. Melissa gave birth to a beautiful baby girl named Ava Grace. One night, just as I was about to snuggle into my bed after a long day, I got a call from Miguel. He never called me this late. "Hi, Miguel. Is everything okay?" I asked worriedly. I heard him sigh heavily over the phone. "Can I see you?" he asked. "Now?" I looked at my clock and it was 10 p.m. "If it's not a problem." "Sure, no problem. I'll be there in 20 minutes." And he hung up. I got up and got ready quickly and waited outside for him. I didn't want my mother to wake up and give me the 100-question scenario. Miguel pulled up and I jumped in. The silence in the car was deafening. We pulled up at Miguel's place. "Would Melissa be okay with me coming over at this hour?" I asked with a raised eyebrow. "She and Ava Grace went to her mother's for the weekend. It's all good," he said as he hopped out of the car. I followed Miguel inside. For the first hour or so, we ate snacks and watched movies, but at the back of my mind, I wanted to know why Miguel wanted to see me in the first place. I cleared my throat. Miguel, is there something you wanted to talk?" I watched as Miguel walked into the bedroom and came back out with his phone. He handed me the phone without saying a word. I took the phone and pressed play on the video that was on the screen. My mouth dropped when I recognized Melissa and Brian, Miguel's coworker, dancing and kissing in a club. "Miguel, I'm so sorry." I threw my hands around his neck and pulled him close. Miguel relaxed into my arms, and we just held each other for a few minutes. "So what are you going to do now?" I asked as I slowly moved out of his grasp to look into his eyes. "Well, when I found out, I took Ava Grace for a paternity test without Melissa knowing. I got back the results earlier today, and I found out that Ava Grace isn't mine." I confronted Melissa, and she confessed that she wasn't sure. "She moved out today and went to stay with her mother," he said, and he shrugged his shoulders. The hurt in Miguel's voice was almost unbearable. I didn't know how to comfort him or help him deal with this sudden change in his life. "What can I do to make it better?" I asked. "Can you stay the night?" Miguel asked. I agreed to spend the night with Miguel. I texted Jet and told him that I had a long day and I would probably sleep in the next day. I also messaged my mother and told her that I was spending the night at Jet's house so she wouldn't be worried when she woke up the next day and didn't see me. I didn't tell her that it was actually Miguel I was staying with, in case she started worrying about Miguel. Over the next few weeks, Miguel and I spent a lot of time together. I even blew off a few dates with Jet to spend time with Miguel. I told Jet that I had a lot of work to do, and he wasn't pleased because he knew I was a workaholic and had my moments. One night while out at dinner with Jet, a wave of nausea came to me. "Kelly, are you okay?" Jet asked in a concerned voice. "I'm okay." I smiled weakly. Jet called the waiter and asked for the bill. I excused myself and told him that I needed to go to the bathroom. As soon as I stood up, a wave of dizziness came over me, and I felt my knees buckle. Jet caught me just before I hit the ground. He scooped me up like a baby and held me close. I heard him tell the waiter that he was going to take me to the car and come back and pay the bill. When we got to the car, Jet made sure that I was secure before rushing back into the restaurant. I kept my eyes closed for the entire trip home as Jet gently caressed my hand during the ride. We went back to his place. He got me ready for bed and then tucked me in. I fell asleep the instant my head hit the pillow. The next day, Jet insisted that I go to the doctor, so we went. To his surprise, and my dismay, the doctor said that, yep, you guessed it, I was pregnant. After the doctor's office, Jet took me to a little cafe to get breakfast. "Please, don't tell my mom yet," I pleaded. "I want to tell her when the time is right." Jet nodded in agreement. I watched as he removed a small black velvet box from his jacket. "I've been carrying around this box for months trying to figure out the right time to do this," he said. He stood up and walked over to my side of the table, and he knelt in front of me. A small "aww" escaped the lips of the few customers and employees in the cafe. He took my hand and looked into my eyes. "Kelly, will you marry me?" I looked around the cafe at the hopeful faces, then down at Jet. I forced a smile and nodded as he slipped the ring on my finger. An applause rose from the cafe, and a look of victory on Jet's face was somewhat amusing. All I could think on the ride back to my house was how I was going to tell Jet I was already married. My mother was excited when we announced our engagement.
Oh my God.
She went straight into preparation mode, even though Jet and I had not even set a date for the wedding yet. I excused myself and left Jet and my mother talking excitedly. I went to my room and messaged Miguel. I told him that I needed to see him urgently. That night I snuck out and met Miguel. I told him about the events that took place that day. He listened attentively, and when I finished, he looked at me. "So what do you want to do? Do you want to get married to Jet?" he asked. "I know. I don't want to raise this baby on my own," I cried. Miguel looked at me as though he was about to say something, but decided against it. He told me that whatever I decided to do, that he would support me. The next 3 months were very hectic, as I decided that I would get married to Jet before I began to show. I didn't dissolve my marriage with Miguel, because he still did not have citizenship in the country, and I did not want to jeopardize that for him. I did, however, invite Miguel to the wedding. That morning I was more sick than I had ever been. My mother thought it was just my nerves, since I didn't tell her about the pregnancy yet. I was finally ready to walk down the aisle. I took my uncle's arm and looked around the church for Miguel's familiar face, but it was nowhere to be seen. I couldn't help but feel somehow hurt. During the ceremony, there was a commotion outside the church. A few seconds later, Miguel burst in through the front doors of the church. "Jet!" he shouted angrily. "Don't you have something to tell Kelly?" "Miguel, what are you doing?" I asked frantically. Just then a woman and 2 children walked into the church. I recognized her as one of the ladies that sat with Jet at the restaurant the first night we met. "Jet, why don't you introduce Kelly to your wife of 6 years?" Before I could react, my mother was at my side and slapped Jet squarely in the face. "Your business here is done," she said angrily. "I think your wife is calling you." Jet walked away and walked straight past the woman and children without saying a word. I couldn't believe it. Jet was already married, and he hadn't told me. I mean, I suppose I'd done the same to him, but still. My mother apologized to the guests and told them that they were more than happy to stay for the food and drinks since they were already paid for. Everyone cleared out of the church, and my mother left Miguel and I to talk. "Thank you," I said. "Anything for the woman that I love," he said and leaned in to kiss me. I was shocked. Miguel was actually kissing me. We pulled apart, and I said, "I think it's time to tell my mom about our marriage." Miguel held my hand and said, "Let's go. No matter the outcome, just know that I will always have your back." I gave birth to a baby girl that year. Her name is Isabella, and she's now 5 years old. I was a bit disappointed when the paternity test came back, and Miguel was not the father, but that didn't stop him from loving Isabella with all his heart. We are currently expecting a boy soon, to complete our little family. If I had to sum up my experience, I would say that love truly conquers all. Hi, my name is Kelly, and I've got a crazy story to tell. But first, like and subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell too.